Hello, this is Jordan. This video is being recorded on the morning of Thursday, March 1st, 2024. Thank you so much for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to discuss the status of the potential commodity supercycle that everyone's been talking about over the last couple of years. Well, at least not recently, as commodity prices have come down. Stock markets around the world, not just in the US, have recovered significantly. This video, I'll go through some slides and discuss the status of the commodity supercycle. If you don't want to watch a long video, the Cliff Notes version is commodity supercycle will be strongly in effect after the secular bull market in the stock market ends. Now, of course, there can be some overlap like we saw in the mid to late 1960s, so that definitely is possible. It makes it a little bit more difficult to distinguish exactly, are we in the super cycle or not? And another point on top of that is we saw the same thing also in the 1930s and 40s. There was a lot of overlap there, particularly in the 40s. But, enough talk from me. Let's get into some charts in the video. And sentimenttrader.com, a great service. I forget the gentleman's name who was talking about this. He's had a couple commodity reports that I think are very actionable, very interesting. And the first one here is the Bloomberg Commodity Index divided by the S&P 500. I think this Bloomberg Index tends to be more equal weighted amongst the commodities. I prefer the indexes that are equal weighted by price, and that way they're not distorted by. They include the cost of contract rollover and all those things, and then you see that chart floating around about commodities against the S&P 500. It's at some 200-year low, and commodities have to, rally significantly. But anyway, I'm getting off the point. But here we can see, I wish this went back further, but we can see here, this is when the secular bear in stock started, right around here. It also started here, too. And, at some point, I think maybe this year, maybe in the next couple years, it's also going to start around this point. And so we'll probably see the same thing. We'll get more into this ratio later, but that's important. And also the piece from Sentiment Trader, they talk about a 30-year cycle, and that we're actually coming into in the middle, or is actually the middle of 2023, well, at least the 15-year cycle for commodities. Well, because you have 15 years up for commodities, and then commodities are down the next 15 years, stocks are up, and so they alternate. One thing to remember is, and so this is the purple here, I think that's purple or blue, whatever, I'm colorblind. So this is the 15-year rolling return for stocks. The black is 15-year rolling return for commodities. Now, remember, commodities peaked 1951, 1981, 2011, and they also peaked in 1920. So I'm not a big believer in cycles. When you're talking about commodities and stocks, there is a secular cycle where one is in a bull, the other's in a bear, and there's trade-offs. And again, there's some overlap, but we're kind of, we might be overlapping a little bit because we're not quite at the point where we can declare stocks in a secular bear yet. But anyway, so 51, 81, 2011, those peaks. And so based on that cycle, the next potential peak could be 2040. I've seen charts talking about 2038, 2045, that could be a peak. Now, based on the cycle that Sentiment Trader is looking at, they say the 15-year up cycle for commodities started in the middle of 23. So let's just round it to the end of the year and just say the beginning of 2039. So they're saying that a new 15-year up cycle for commodities has started. And so that kind of aligns with, this 30-year cycle, or the major peaks in inflation being every 60 years, because you had the Civil War in the 1860s, 1920, 1980, and then 2040. So those are like real major peaks in inflation. So I think there's a lot of data here that points to that's what we could be looking at, over the next 10 to 15 years. And so based on that, the commodity supercycle has barely started. If you think about that and how much time is left, and then secondly, the fact that the stock market has not gone into a secular bear yet, that tells us that we're still at the beginning. But anyway, this is interesting because based on the black line here, and these aren't price bottoms, but they're these are bottoms in the 15-year rolling return. So you had these bottoms here 30 years later, almost exactly here. So another 30 years later, that kind of puts us at somewhere in the mid 2020s, 2027. So if you think about it, 2011 was when commodities peaked. So 15-year 2026, the returns in 2026 are going to be pretty shitty. So this is lining up, I think, to come down, and maybe at 2026 maybe it makes a bottom, and then maybe we get a recession in the next couple years, and so commodity prices come down again, and so you can see how the history can repeat. But anyway, I think that's what's important to understand is you have these long cycles in commodities, and we're even though we had this here, maybe we're not yet in the super cycle. And so this GCC, that's an equal weighted commodity basket. And so here, this is GCC against the stock market. So this was terrible. Maybe it's making a double bottom here, or maybe it's going to go lower. I mean, gun to my head, I think it's probably going to go lower and make a new low. But this is interesting here because this is GCC, and it's retraced about 50%. So from a bird's eye view, this is bullish because at this point it's retraced 50%. It's held up for the last couple years after the big sell-off in 22. But you see the 200, 400-day moving averages here. It's really struggling with those. So there's no indication that it can go like this. But, at some point this year, if the economic recovery gains traction, and especially if oil looks very similar to this, if oil can break out of this similar formation and kind of pull commodities up, it is possible that maybe commodities will start to rally and make a move before the end of the year, and then maybe that's when you start to get fears of stagflation going into 2025. And I mean, that's just a scenario I'm potentially thinking about. Another thing that's actually bullish for commodities here this year, and this chart is 1 month old, but this is looking at the combined managed money position in various commodities. So consider it like a COT for commodities as a whole. And so this here, I don't know what, okay, they're using the Bloomberg Spot Commodity Index, and I don't know what color this is. What is this, green or orange? So that's the price of commodities. And then this in histogram form, you can see, I mean, look how low this was in 2019. Look how low it was here. I just consider it the amount of speculation in commodities as a whole. So you can see this here, it was below zero. That lined up with the 2016 low. I mean, again, you can see these here after COVID. And look, we're back here again. So sentiment on commodities and fund flows, I mean, it's all going into stocks now. It's starting to really go into crypto again. So this, I mean, if commodities can start moving, I mean, there's definitely, and if inflation becomes a significant concern over the next quarter or two, there's definitely room for commodities to rally this year. That's all for commodities. Don't want this to be a super long video, but that's where we are. I mean, with respect to the super cycle, I don't think you can declare a super cycle until the stock market falls into a secular bear. And by the way, if we get a rally in commodities and inflation pulls up or inflation rises, and that can be stagflationary, that tips the economy into recession, stock market cracks. So it's actually that's one scenario where you get a potential move in commodities this year, and oil moves up, oil's breaking out of that bottoming base. That could lead to the rollover of the stock market and the end of the secular bull. And, for the third or fourth time, at that point, then we can really say that a new secular bull in commodities has started, or a new super cycle. So either way, I think the outlook for commodities this year, I mean, it looks to be pretty good unless we're going to have a recession hit in the next couple quarters. Aside from that, I think the outlook is pretty good, and it looks like in the next couple of years we could be coming into a new super cycle. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment. Talk to you guys again in the next video.